Okay, let's begin. We're very happy to have Yuriy Gorodnichenko here with two of his co-authors, Alexander Talavera. I see him. I don't know where No Fam is, but he's coming on soon, I think, I hope. But it's an intriguing paper, a fascinating paper. It's a great title, The Voice of Monetary Policy. And new techniques are being used all over the place to find out more of what's going on. So really looking forward to this. If I could say next week, Rajan will speak, and we're going to try to have a little both in person and in Zoom. So hopefully that will work. But this is all in Zoom, and welcome wherever you are around the world. And we'll get started. So Yuriy, go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me start sharing my slides. This is joint work with Sasha and To, and in this work we were motivated by really a revolution in the way monetary policy is communicated to the general public. We made a lot of progress over the last 40 years. You can start with Alan Greenspan basically saying, if you think you understood me, you must be wrong, to a more recent speech by Jay Powell, where he says that, we want to communicate policy to the general public in plain English. We want to make sure that everybody, the financial markets, the professional forecasters, the households, the firms, they all understand our economic outlook. They also understand our policy actions. They also understand why we're doing this stuff and what kind of things they should expect down the road. And, in the same set of remarks, he went on and said that to improve this communication exercise, he really wants to have a press conference after every FOMC meeting. And, the way he said this here is very interesting. He said, I want to have a conversation. Right? He wants to have Q&A. People ask questions, he's going to provide answers. And so it's kind of a two-direction conversation. Now, one trick with the conversation is that it's not just about words, right? So communication is much more complicated. There was a famous study by Mehrabian in the 70s, when he said that if you look at typical communication, you can have this rule of thumb. The words, the text, conveys roughly 7% of the message. Right? So what is written down, you look at, as I said, textual material, you will get 7% of what is being told. If you look at the body language, gestures, facial expressions, that is going to account for roughly 50% of the communication. So we tell you not just words, we're also conveying emotions, how we interpret what we're trying to communicate to the other party in this conversation, and also the voice, how you say it. Like it can be in a sad voice, in a happy voice, in a surprised voice, in an angry voice. This is also very important. It kind of colors the message that you provide, and this accounts for roughly 40% of the conversation. Now, to be clear, these percentages are not exact science, and there is a lot of debate about, what exactly is being communicated and how in a typical conversation. But in any case, it's clear that communication is not just text. You have to also convey emotions if you want to convince your other people in your conversation. Now, historically, there was a lot of research using the textual analysis. You basically do a lot of text mining. You look at the minutes, at the transcripts, statements, reports, and you want to see if the choice of words can convey information that is useful for market participants or the general public. Maybe it will say something about the outlook of the policymakers, policy outlook, economic outlook. Maybe it will say, something about how policymakers are thinking about these issues. This kind of soft information that is not necessarily reflected in the numbers. They may say the Fed funds rate is going to be 2%, but the choice of words around this 2% may be important. Maybe it will tell us about the change, the direction, the magnitude, this kind of thing. And we know from this research that the narrative that the policymakers provide is very important. You can move the economy, at least the financial markets, quite substantially. What is missing in this analysis is the rest of the conversation, the body language, and the voice tone. And there is a recent paper by two economists at the Richmond Fed, Filippo Kurti and Sofia Kazanik, where they look at facial expression and they look at the eye movements, eyebrows, this kind of things, facial recognition, to learn something about the emotions that the Fed chairs have during their press conferences and see if this is going to move financial markets. And they find some evidence consistent with that. What we do in this paper is basically do a similar exercise, but now look at the variation in the voice tone. Is it happy voice? Is it angry voice? And see how much difference it's going to make for the financial markets. Now, why or how in the world this kind of variation may be important? It's very hard to think of how traders are going to use this information exactly, but we have a lot of anecdotes. And here's one of them by Felicia Taylor, who was covering the press conference that was held by Ben Bernanke some years ago. She says, look, we're just about to turn on to this press conference. Traders, they want to see how Ben Bernanke, is going to read into everything, the voice of the tone of his voice, his body language, his inflection, or any clue about the direction the markets are still looking for. So to me, this kind of quote suggests that there is a lot of soft information in this Q&A sessions. Markets are looking for hints, for clues that, we're in a certain position in terms of economic situation, or maybe the Fed chair is going to slip something that will inform the traders about the direction of future policy, something which is not necessarily reflected in the hard numbers or even in the text. And so that's why this body language, the voice, may be important sources of information for these traders. Now, what do we do with this? Okay, so what we're going to do is roughly the following. We're going to look at press conferences after FOMC meetings, and I'll explain in a bit why we're going to focus on these particular events. Then we're going to develop a model which is going to convert sound waves into emotions, okay? Once we do that, we can construct for every press conference the tone of the voice, right? Was it a happy press conference or a sad press conference or an angry press conference? And then we want to see if this kind of thing is going to move the financial markets, okay? And in a nutshell, what we find is that the tone appears to have a considerable effect on the stock market, on uncertainty, on inflation expectations, and some other financial variables. It's not going to move the markets always and everywhere, and there is some work to be done here to fully understand how this works exactly. And in part, it's sensitive to what is being communicated to the markets. Probably going to depend on the state of the economy and where we are in the policy cycle. But one lesson which is clear for us is that how policy is communicated is important. And this variation in voice, how you say things, you may be like a robot in a flat voice, or you may use emotions, happy, sad, angry, and so on. And with this, you can convey information that is useful to market participants in the broader economy, probably. Now, for this research, we have to use voice recordings, right? And for once, we found useful that the YouTube channel of the Fed is a very useful source of information. It doesn't have a lot of subscribers, 50,000, 60,000 people, which is very little for social media. But what is great about this source is that every press conference is being recorded and it's going to be stored on this website. In fact, it's YouTube, but here it's also available. And so then what you can do, you can use this information to process, how things were said during the Q&A sessions, and this is going to be useful for us to measure variation in the voice tone from one press conference to another. Now, why are we going to use Q&A sessions instead of other events done by the Fed? Well, in a nutshell, there are several reasons. The first reason is that the Q&A has a relatively straightforward structure. You have opening remarks, and then you have question, answer, question, answer. Nobody is interrupting the Fed chair. He is not interrupting, or she is not interrupting the journalists. So it's kind of very well-structured conversation. This is great for us. What's also great for us is that we know that policymakers take these events very, very seriously, and they often use Q&A sessions to clarify the future outlook in terms of policy and also in terms of what they think about the current state of the economy or the future state of the economy. And this is especially important in times of high uncertainty. For example, the next press conference by Jay Powell is going to be very, very informative about how they think about inflation expectations. Are they going to keep interest rates low? I'm sure they will face lots and lots of questions like this, and this press conference may be extremely useful and informative for the general public. Now, one thing I wanted to emphasize is that these events, as I said, are taken very, very seriously. And my favorite piece here comes from Janet Yellen, who, in the end of the FOMC meeting, had a scene and she said, okay, so we're done here. Box lunches will be available. And if anybody wants to watch TV in the spatial library and see me skewered at the press conference, please feel free. I will do my best to communicate the points that we have made here, end of meeting. So this is literally the end of the FOMC meetings. And, lots and lots of hours go into preparation for this Q&A. There is like a mock interview, mock Q&A session, a lot of briefing and debriefing. So a lot of effort goes into these events. Now, what is key for us, however, is that these Q&A sessions, unlike other interactions with the general public, are unscripted. So, most of the time when you hear the Fed chair speaking, this is going to be a script, like a text. And then the Fed chair is going to read this one for one with minimal deviations. Usually it's very dull. Sometimes it's interesting, but most of the time there is really no emotion. What is great about Q&A is that, there is no prepared answer most of the time, and they have to improvise. And as a result, they can also try to, maybe at least subconsciously, to convey not only kind of the words, the text of what they want to say, but also how they think about these issues, their emotions. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? And this may be very informative. Remember this quote I gave you from a CNN reporter saying that the traders are looking at the tone, the posture, body language, all those kind of things to see, how comfortable or uncomfortable the Fed chairs are in these press conferences. So potentially it makes a big difference, if it's a prepared set of remarks or not a prepared set of remarks. And Q&A is one when they don't have a script, and this is great for us. We can have a free flow conversation. One thing I should say from get-go is that we don't have many press conferences. We have only about 40 press conferences. It's going to be a small sample size, and so we'll have to be always aware of the fact that it's a small sample. It's prone to data mining. It's prone to even one or two observations which may be influential and so on. So we'll do our best to address this kind of issues, but the only solution to this problem really is just to have a bigger sample. We'll have to wait for more years of data to have a larger sample size. As I said, we'll use only answers of the chair during the Q&A sessions. We're not going to look at, what the journalists are saying because, they're very different people. The questions tend to be relatively short, and this does not allow us to quantify, the tone in which the questions were asked. And as I said, this comes from the official sources, from the Fed YouTube channel, which doesn't have many subscribers, but it has a lot of useful information. Now, we have relatively few press conferences, but we have lots and lots of answers, roughly 700 answers from 3 speakers, Bernanke, Powell, and Yellen. And so again, this gives us a little bit more precision for every press conference. We have about 30 answers for each press conference. And this kind of gives us a little bit more precision for the voice tone for each particular conference. But we should, again, keep in mind that this is a small sample size and everything is going to be sensitive to small sample issues. All right, so how does this look? Let me stop sharing my slides and instead let me share my screen with the video so you can see for yourself how this works. Let me play this video.
Gina Smilik, Bloomberg News. You mentioned earlier that, there is always going to be some uncertainty in the global economy. Yet it seems that uncertainties are what kept you from hiking this month. How do you communicate to markets? What is the kind of uncertainty that keeps you from lifting rates? And what is the kind of uncertainty that you can overlook and, move in spite of?
So that's a very hard question. And, it's why we come together and have very careful evaluations of a wide range of factors. But at the end of the day, what we're focused on are 2 things: the path for employment and whether or not we feel confident that we're on a road that will take us to our maximum employment objective.
All right, so this is a typical interaction. There is a question and then there is a response. All right. You can run this through professional software to have a full description of what is being said. You saw these blue bars going under the video. This is sound waves. You can do this in a more systematic manner, run this from using the professional software. And, for every frame, you're also going to have a measurement of sound waves. This green stuff here at the bottom of the slide is a sequence of sound waves, right? So this is audio track. What we're going to do is to take these audio tracks, okay? So, when Yellen starts speaking, okay, so this segment starting here and in here, you look at this voice, this sound waves, what is the emotion here? Is it positive, negative? What is being conveyed here? Now, historically, this has been very difficult to do because we didn't really have technology to do this, but now with huge progress in voice recognition and understanding human speech, we can actually do this. And conceptually, the way this is going to work is going to be something like this. We have this sound waves, right? We have this recordings, okay? This is going to be our input. And then we're going to have emotions. Are you happy when you say this stuff? Are you angry when you say this stuff? You can say, as I said, things in different emotions. You can be happy, sad, angry, and so on. The mapping from here to here is difficult, okay? And so historically, it has been very hard to do this. But now with machine learning, you can actually look at the sound waves and convert them into emotions through some classification routine. Okay, so think about this. In the olden days, if you just had 2 states, high and low, you can run a logic where you use this as an input and classify something into high or low. With emotions, we can have a spectrum of possibilities. So it's a little bit more complicated, but conceptually, it's a classification routine. Now, what we need to do next is to have a training sample where we can explain to this routine how to interpret the sound waves, this audio track, into emotions, how we classify this stuff. And ideally, we would like to have Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke or Jay Powell speak to us in different emotions, a happy voice, an angry voice, And we're going to then have their recordings and their emotions, and then we can have this mapping between the sound waves and their emotions. Obviously, we cannot do that. But what we can do is to ask professional actors to say something to us. So we're going to have their sound waves. And we're also going to ask them to speak in certain emotions. You know, say something in a happy voice, say something in an angry voice. And so we'll have a sound wave and a matching emotion. And then we need to find a way that is going to classify the sound waves to emotions. And we know what they are because we ask actors to say to us something in a particular voice. Now, how this is done? Okay, so there is a lot of research on this in voice recognition. We're not definitely the first here. This is one popular source of information, Ryerson Audiovisual Database, where you have some actors saying different sentences in various emotions. You can say, you know, the dogs are at the door in a calm voice, or like the dogs are at the door in a happy voice, or fearful, oh, the dogs are at the door, you know, this kind of sense. I'm not very good at this, and I'm sure I'm not going to be a very good Fed chair for at least this reason. But you know, the key here is that you have different people saying the same sentence in different emotions, and this is going to create for us a situation where we have inputs and we have outputs. We just need to create a mapping from here to here. Okay. Now, this is one training sample. We can use another one. This is coming from Toronto Emotional Speech Test, where two actresses are going to say 200 target words, like, you know, door, open, close, high, low. You know, it's basically a random set of words, again, in different emotions. And so again, it creates for us an input, sound waves, and it creates for us outputs because we know in which emotion the scene was said. Now, what we need to do is to have this matching kind of exercise when we say, okay, here is a sound wave, here is an emotion, here is another sound wave, here is another emotion. Okay, so we need to do this matching. In this exercise, we're going to focus only on 5 emotions. And in part, this is because, you know, it's extremely unlikely you'll have a fearful reaction or disgust during a typical Q&A session. You know, maybe when they discuss inflation, next time they will be fearful or disgusted, I don't know. But, you know, in our sample, we don't see this kind of reactions. So we'll focus on 5 more standard reactions. And in terms of inputs, because, you know, sound waves have a lot of information, we're going to focus on basically 3 summary statistics. And the way it works is basically take the sound waves, and apply spectral analysis to it. So, you know, we do this all the time in macroeconomics. When you look at power spectrum, you look at magnitudes, amplitude of the waves, we'll look at the shares of waves at different frequencies, high and low, this kind of stuff. John, you have a question.
Yep, just fascinating, and I want to learn. I want to learn more about the technology. I'm surprised that there aren't. First of all, I'm surprised there isn't a sort of a large, immense standard database that one could plug this through. That we have to go to actors to do stuff like this. I would have thought that there was, you know, some big standard one. And I'd also think that what you're looking for here is not so much actors on how do they feel about the dogs coming in the door, but if there was such a thing as polygraphs or police interviewing suspects, because the kind of emotions that you're looking for in a Fed chair is I'm kind of pulling one over on you, or well, the committee makes me say this thing, but I really don't think it's the way it is, which are the kinds of emotions that aren't really going to be represented in these actor scripts. I'd love to see, you know, for example, transcripts of hundreds of hours of interviewing criminals about things and trying to get their emotions. Anyway, I'm just tell us more about what's available here in this in this world of you know, pre-trained algorithms on detecting emotions in speech. Yeah,
so, you know, this technology is making advances every day what we have here is publicly available data sets. There is a lot more commercial stuff out there which uses proprietary technology to classify sound waves into emotions. We decided to do ourselves this classification because we don't know what they use exactly, what kind of text, what kind of words. And we use 2 publicly available sources. There are more. Also, to be clear, the way it works is that you take this training sample and then you're going to split it into something you will use for estimation, and then another kind of the sample is used for validation. And we can extend this to more, but we basically found that you can use just Ryerson or Toronto, and it's going to be more or less the same. So we felt that the marginal value of having another training sample is not very high, but we can.
So you use their training sample to make your own classifier rather than using a pre-existing classifier that tells you emotions of things?
Yes.
Okay.
Because we're waiting.
Pre-existing classifier, is there like off-the-shelf software that I could use that's already pre-trained, and I could say, well, is John Taylor grumpy at me today or not? Without having to retrain.
Yeah, you can do that, and you have to pay for that.
Okay, but these things exist. Thanks a lot.
It exists, and one thing you just mentioned to this right now, that in principle you can use this technology to see when somebody is lying or not lying. We don't want to do this because we don't want to say somebody is lying during the press conference. But if you want to do it, we can help you. All right, so we have the sound waves. And we run spectral analysis on this. We have some summary statistics, and this is going to be inputs for us. Okay, so what is the next step is very simple. We have the summary statistics for sound waves, so it's going to be our input. Then we're going to have emotions. This comes from actors. We know how to interpret this audio segment in terms of this emotion. So all we need to do is now just to have an efficient way to classify this audio tracks into the set of emotions. The network I show here is actually what we use. You don't have to have a super complicated model, and we don't want to overfit for sure. So it's a relatively simple network, but it goes pretty far. The accuracy is relatively high, 84% on average, which tells us if you give us a soundtrack from basically a random person, or an average person, I should say, we're going to be very good at saying, if this person is happy, sad, angry, and so on. And again, there's probably some scope for improvement here. We can use more training data sets. We can use other people, other words, other dictionaries. As John mentioned, ideally we would like to have, say, a press conference run by the Fed chair, and then we have independent evaluators who are going to show us the emotions that happen during this Q&A sessions. Like, Janet Yellen, okay, so I showed you a video. Was she happy, sad? We have a pool of 50 people who are looking at this video, and they're going to tell you if she was happy, sad, and so on.
Is that the full list of emotions you guys used, or do you use it?
Only 5.
So you don't get exasperated, annoyed. I'm trying to think of my emotions when answering questions in class.
No.
Yuri, Òscar has a question.
Òscar, please.
Hi, Yuri. So my question is, if someone is classified as being angry, do we know that they're angry because of an action related to monetary policy, or they're angry because their neighbor didn't trim the hedges?
Well, so we know this person is angry. We don't know why. Maybe Janet Yellen is angry at the reporter, or maybe she's angry at the economy, or something else. We just know she is angry.
So Bob?
So the power spectrum contains, rounded to 3 digits, 0% of the information in an utterance. So is there some basis in this scientific analysis of voice that, you would never be able to figure out you could never prepare a transcript using this approach because you're throwing away almost all the information that would be necessary to get a transcript that actually recovers the words. I just wondered why you chose to use the power spectrum.
Well, this is what is usually used in voice recognition. You have a power spectrum, you have different frequencies, and then depending on the pitch, one of this is capturing the pitch. You can learn something about whether this is happy, sad, surprising, and so on.
Yeah, but when I'm dealing with Comcast over their voice recognition system, which every Comcast customer has to do all too frequently, they're actually pretty good at decoding information that is not present in the power spectrum, the actual words.
Yeah,
so there's another branch of this. Not obviously they're not using the spectrum, right?
No.
Yeah. Okay. So there is a choice here in terms of the available technologies. There's some choice about how you get. This is like indirect inference, where you're choosing some kind of function that summarizes what's in the data.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like the spectrum is kind of an odd choice.
Well, this is what is used in this technology, and it's if you're interested in understanding words, you will have to use something a little different, basically a richer set of statistics. But if you just need emotions, this is all you need.
Yeah, but what is there commercial use of emotions? Does Comcast want to find out how angry I am?
Probably you just to make sure they don't want to know, are you happy or angry?
No, but seriously, what is there a commercial market for just getting an emotion score? Is this a problem that voice technology scientists are solving for commercial customers?
Well, I can tell you this, when you have a call with inventors, so I'm a CEO of some company, and people dial in to hear what I'm going to say about my earnings and so on. People use this kind of software to understand if CEO is happy, angry, uncertain, neutral,
okay.
And
so traders. This has satisfied the market test among traders.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's worth knowing.
There is something like this in the Disneyland or other places where they look at emotions. Michael, Boskin, you had a question.
Hi, Yuri. It's nice to see the Campanile behind you, by the way.
Yes, I second that.
So I'm trying to get a context for this, and maybe I'm getting ahead of your presentation, but maybe Alan Greenspan is the best example. He took great pride in people not having the slightest idea what he was saying. And from my own experience as CEA chair, and certainly from his, it was frequently the case that the leading publications, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, et cetera, you'd have 5 different interpretations of the same words. Now, I don't know what mapping any emotions that allegedly accompanied any of those things had this, but I'm just trying to figure out how you deal with the fact that there's just people who allegedly were supposed to be doing this, and you can argue whether that was actually what they were doing, but they were the financial press, interpreted what was being said so differently. Now, part of that's the substance of the words, to the extent there was any, and part of it is how it was said. So I'm just trying to figure out how to make sense of that. Now, maybe Jay and Janet are not nearly as obtuse as Alan, and maybe it's less probably. But
well, Michael, I can tell you this. The mainstream media, they try to not give subjective assessments of what is done by the Fed chairs. So they're not going to say, the face of Ben Bernanke looked uncertain or something like this, or he frowned at something. They will never say such a thing, or very infrequently. And in part it's because, you may have one reading of facial expressions, I may have another reading of facial expressions, and that's probably why, there is so much disagreement about what is being said. What we try to do here is to bring science into this and say, okay, on average, this is how we should be interpreting the sound waves. And maybe some traders are going to think, okay, that was a bad sign. That was a bad reaction, a sad reaction. And some people are going to say, well, it's probably a good sign. And on average, we will try to see, where the markets are going to be with this technology to kind of make it more scientific.
I think that's a good point, a good idea. I guess you said you had something like 690 answers. I forgot the exact number, but they're across 3 chairs. Mm-hmm. And doing the learning specifically for each of the chairs?
No. So the learning was done on an independent sample. And again, this is just to make sure that it's not tailored specifically to Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen or Jay Powell. And to be clear, we don't have many samples with Janet Yellen to do proper training. We have to have lots and lots of words, lots and lots of emotions.
So how do we deal with major differences in delivering the same script prepared for them by the staff, identical script by the 3 of them? How is that dealt with?
Yeah, so the way it's done is that we try to construct something like, an average American and say, this is how the average American would express his emotions in such and such voice.
There's about 4 or 5 people asking questions. If you want to try to give some results and then come back to the questions.
All right. Okay. But to anticipate your question, I think this is what we do after training the sample. Again, think about this. We take an average American. We have a mapping from the sound waves of this artificial person to emotions. We're going to take these segments. When the Fed chair is speaking, we're going to run the segments through our routine. We're going to classify each response as positive or negative. And then we're going to construct the statistic, which is going to be between -1 and 1. And it's telling us what is the general tone of what is being said at this press conference. Is it positive or negative? On average, it's neutral, but there is a lot of variation. There is also a lot of variation across chairs. Bernanke on average is the most positive. Jay Powell is the most negative. Now, we don't take a stand on why this is happening. Going back to Òscar's question, maybe there is something in their backyard that is making them angry or happy. Maybe Ben Bernanke left Princeton, and that's why he is happy. Janet Yellen left Berkeley. That's why she isn't happy. Or maybe it's all about the state of the economy. Bernanke was really at the dark times for the US economy. He had to radiate positive messages. Maybe that was by design, or maybe Jay Powell is raising interest rates. This is why he has to be negative. Who knows? But in any case, there is a lot of variation across Fed chairs. So we're going to see lots and lots of reactions there. This press conference is happening on very busy days. Right? This is the structure of events. In one part of the sample, later part of the sample, this is how it's done currently. You have a statement, you have economic projections, you have press conference. And so a lot of information is being revealed on these days. And what is going to be important for us, obviously, is to try to disentangle the variation in the voice tone from everything else that happens on these days. Policy actions, the text of what is being communicated to the public, the state of the economy, the policy cycle, all this kind of information is potentially confounding our results. And we'll try to do our best to address these issues. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is that we have only about 40 observations, so we can't control for everything. We have to be a little bit selective here, but we'll do our best. One specific thing we want to definitely control for is what is in the text. Maybe what is said, the text is perfectly correlated with, the voice in which the things are said. If the text is negative, maybe it's also said in a negative voice. We want to see if this is true. Will be a problem for us. How we do this, we use the standard textual analysis technology, dovish phrases, minus hawkish phrases. Again, this is -1 to +1 statistic. We also look at actual choices made by policymakers, the movements in the short-term rates, asset purchases, forward guidance. We use the shock series constructed by Eric Swanson in a recent JME paper. This is great for us because it covers recent periods when very little action was happening through conventional policy tools, but this gives us a useful benchmark. And finally, because all these chairs were speaking in different times, I told you Bernanke was in a difficult part of the sample. J. Powell was in an easy or relatively easy part of the sample. We want to make sure that we control for where policymakers are in terms of lowering interest rates, keeping them fixed or raising them. And for that, we use the shadow policy rate constructed by Cynthia Wu and Shear in JMCB. Now, the way we're going to do then is to first examine what is the correlation between, say, tax sentiment, are policymakers dovish in the choice of their words, and how this compares with the voice in which they're talking. Are they happy voice, angry voice? And what you should see here is that in general, there is a positive correlation, but this correlation is not perfect. So what Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke are saying is not perfectly correlated with what is in the text. And this is good for us because it provides us with independent variation for the voice tone. You can also look at actions. You raise interest rates, you say something about the future course of monetary policy, you say something about asset purchases, or you're just looking at the state of the policy cycle. There is some correlation here, but it's not perfect. And again, this is good news for us because we want to make sure that this variation in voice is independent variation. There is something in it, at least potentially. If we have perfect correlation, we can't say anything. Now, formally, we're going to do the following exercise. We have some outcome variable. This is going to be a return for some asset between T, the open price on the day of the FOMC press conference, and the close price on day T plus H. So for example, on the day of the press conference, this is going to be open price, close price. We're going to use that. We're going to use the Jordà local projection, a great technique to construct impulse responses. And we're going to run this for different age, collect these coefficients, and as they're going to tell us about how these returns respond to variation in the tool. Also going to look at tax sentiment, policy actions, and the state of the policy cycle. We're going to look at these coefficients. It will help us to understand the economic magnitudes of what happens here, and also contrast the reactions of the markets to voice tone against, for example, policy actions. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that the unit of analysis is the press conference. We have relatively few observations, so we'll have to use Bootstrap for everything, to correct coefficients, for possible biases, to construct standard errors, confidence bands. So we'll have to take care of this small sample issues with Bootstrap. In terms of assets we're going to use, most of the things we're going to work with the daily frequency. Most of the stuff is publicly available ETFs, exchange traded funds. We know they track underlying securities pretty well. These are relatively liquid funds. And it kind of gives us a very quick and dirty way to understand, how the financial markets are reacting to, say, variation in voice or Fed funds rate shocks or forward guidance shocks. Okay. Any questions about methodology here?
There's actually quite a few questions. You want to hear those now or what?
Oh, it's fine. I can go on, and if people.
Yeah. Why don't you finish off, and then we'll have the questions.
All right. Okay. Sounds good. All right. So here's the first set of results. What happens with the stock market when the Fed chair is increasing the positivity of his voice by 1? Okay. So think about this as he or she starts neutral, and then he or she becomes totally positive. There is no negative messages in his or her responses. This figure is saying that on impact at the time of Q&A session, right? By the end of the day, there is a small increase in the stock market, but it's not very high. But then over time, this reaction is building up and the stock market is increasing by roughly 100 basis points. It's a very strong reaction. And this is what happens if you do not have any controls. But as I said, these are busy, busy days and a lot of other information is being revealed. So what happens if we control for this sense using the regression analysis, Jordà projection? Qualitatively, it's the same response, maybe a little bit more attenuated. On impact, very little reaction, then it builds up and it becomes a big number, 100 basis points. What happens if you use textual analysis, right? So if you have more dovish phrases, not much, and this is consistent with other research in this literature. Also, it's in part a reflection of the relatively small sample that we have with start in 2011, and the Fed language is not changing a lot from one meeting to another, and so we don't have a lot of variation here. It's part of the reason why we don't find anything significant. Fed funds rate shocks, again, most of the sample is basically you at zero, nothing is happening, that's why nothing is significant. Forward guidance, okay, so this is where the first time we see a big response to an actual policy action. You promise to raise interest rates in the future by 1 standard deviation, by the way, so all the shocks are standardized to have unit variance. And the stock market is tanking by roughly 50 to 100 basis points. Why is this useful? So this is what was documented before. There is nothing new here. But the reason why it's useful for us is because you can look at this magnitude, right? So roughly 100 basis points. Compare it with this magnitude, roughly 100 basis points. And it's telling us that this variation in tone is potentially as powerful as 1 standard deviation shock to forward guidance. So this is telling us economically it may be very significant. Asset purchases shocks, not much of a reaction. Now, why is this happening? Okay, I told you, traders are probably looking at what the Fed chair is saying, how he or she is saying things, and there is potentially soft information in these emotions. And if so, it must be reflected in other financial indicators. What we find here, for example, for VIX, is that if you have a more positive Fed chair, uncertainty is decreasing. Okay? Uncertainty is decreasing. So it's as if, a happy Fed chair is saying, things are going to be okay, you don't have to worry about this, economic outlook, everything is under control, uncertainty is decreasing, there is taking capacity of the financial markets probably is bigger now, they can bid up prices. So this can explain why we have these positive reactions. It's kind of one channel. You can also look at how much guidance is provided by the Fed with these emotions. Specifically, you can look basically at the spread between corporate bonds and bonds which are hedged. So it's the same portfolio, and the only thing which is different between them is basically interest rate risk or passive interest rates. And as a benchmark, the Fed is raising interest rates, promising to raise interest rates. This spread is declining, okay? And we see roughly a similar reaction if we look at the voice tone. And so to us, it's saying, look, if the Fed chair is positive, it's probably because the economic outlook is good. The Fed is going to be raising interest rates. And so as a result, markets perceive that interest rates are going to be higher in the future. And so this is why, these two things are moving in tandem. What happens if you look just at bonds? Okay, so this is an index of government bonds, not much of a reaction here. Okay, so it's a little bit puzzling. We wanted to see more of a reaction, but this is what the data tell us. What happens if you look at corporate bonds? Again, very similar situation, not much of a reaction, but we know the bond market is responding very strongly to policy actions. Now, what happens with inflation expectations? This is the key statistic for us. We can calculate this as a difference between an ETF tracking nominal bonds minus ETF tracking inflation protected bonds. If this thing is going up, it means inflation expectations are going down. And so what we see here, if you have a positive Fed chair, again, on impact, not much is happening. But then over time, people think, okay, inflation is going to be lower, and maybe this is why the Fed chair is happy, right? Inflation is under control. Here's another metric for measuring inflation expectations. The price of gold, an ETF tracking the price of gold. Here, the estimates are more noisy, but qualitatively, it's a similar reaction. If you hear a happy Fed chair, this is a strong signal, presumably, that inflation is under control, and that's what's reflected here in this data. And again, let me go back here to make one more point here. If you look at the magnitudes of these responses, right? So roughly 0.2 basis points, 0.2 basis points here. This is very, very similar. So one standard deviation shock to forward guidance. You promise to raise interest rates in the future. It generates more or less the same reaction that you have when you sound more positive when you're the Fed chair. Now, exchange rate, this is where the picture is more complicated. But in a nutshell, what we see here is some reaction of some currencies to positive emotions of the Fed chair. For example, here, when you look at the euro-dollar exchange rate, you have a more positive Fed chair, the dollar is going to appreciate. You look at the yen, and it's not clear that there is much of an action here. So here the story is a little bit more complicated, but at minimum, some of the currencies are going to be reacting to these emotions. To make sure we have plenty of time for answering questions, let me quickly say what we learned from this. There is a revolution in the way policy is communicated. From Greenspan being totally incomprehensible to Jay Powell, presumably very clear. Do we fully understand or utilize this tool? Let me remind you that there is this rule of thumb out there that 7% of the communication is text, 55% is body language, roughly 40% is variation in tone. Our results appear to suggest that this variation in tone may be a powerful channel for communicating policy. How this works exactly, well, it seems that there is some soft information that is being conveyed to the financial markets through this variation in the voice tone. We see that VIX is moving. We see that anticipation of future rate changes is moving. We see inflation expectations are moving, exchange rates are moving. So there is something about this information that moves the markets. Presumably, these are clues and hints that are provided by the Fed chair. And kind of summarize where we are here, Ronald Reagan famously said, how can a president not be an actor? I don't have an answer for that, but I can give you another question, which is how can a Fed chair not be an actor? And I'll stop here and I'll be happy to answer questions. I see lots of questions.
Yeah, lots of questions. I wrote down in the chat. So maybe I see John Lipsky, if he's still here, he has a question. It was pretty early on, John.
I'm here, but I think it's been covered. Thanks.
Christine Strong. Christine?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Maybe you covered this, Yuriy, and I didn't hear it. But I was just wondering if at any point in the paper you addressed the possibility that stereotypes in emotional expression can essentially determine tone of voice, and specifically in your case with Fed chairs, gender differences. I'm wondering if it's something you talk about in the paper at all.
Yeah, so what we try to do is to have a balanced sample of actors who are speaking. And it's true, there is a big difference in age across Fed chairs, gender differences, cultural backgrounds and so on. We try to stay away from this in the sense that we don't want to train an algorithm specifically to Jay Powell or specifically to Janet Yellen. But in principle, this is doable. You just need to have a sufficiently large sample to do that stuff.
Axel Merck still here, or did he leave? I guess he left.
I'm here. Yes. Now, I more of a comment than a question, but let me phrase it as happily as possible. It was mostly in the beginning to kind of the use cases, and I think it's really the sky is the limit on these. You can apply this to anything and anything, and I think we are completely naive if we think that companies like Comcast don't want to judge our mood. I mean, maybe they don't do it yet, but I'm pretty sure that Facebook and others are doing this left and right. And ultimately, I think just as in this presentation, right, you had some parameters to find, independent variables. It's always a question of what it is you want to optimize. And the fact that journalists come to different conclusions, we have to think about the objective function of a journalist. They want to sell their story. They don't want to necessarily make money in the market. They want to have a big headline. Whereas market participants are paying a fortune for some of these databases, because in a world where all information is available, you're trying to find that little edge and trying to kind of adjust always your algorithm. So I think it's the sky is really the limit with this sort of technology, and we're really at the very beginning of it.
Alex, it's you can do so much with this. We're just scratching the surface, and you can as I said to John before, John Cochrane, that you can detect if somebody is lying or not. We don't take this route, but that may be the next chapter. James Hamilton.
Yeah, very interesting, Yuri. I was surprised at the choice of window. I would have thought in terms of minutes rather than days. For your 7:55:38 rule, my prior guess would be 90% of the market reaction on an FOMC day comes within the first 15 minutes. And this whole mechanism has to be, during the press conference. You want to say a little more about why people 10 days later are reacting to the emotion they saw?
Jim, it's a great question. We wish the financial markets were efficient in decoding these emotions and, an immediate reaction, and then basically a flat line, similar to what we see for forward guidance shocks and asset purchases. We don't see this. And we have a conjecture that the reason why it's so is because with this kind of information, it takes time to process, what is being said, how things are being said. And I guess, one example of this, that when you have something relatively less standard, like, Donald Trump is elected, and then, first markets collapse, then they start rallying. And, it took them some time to figure out if it's good news or bad news. Maybe something like this is happening here. What we try to do going forward is to look at the media coverage and see if, people are picking up these emotions, if they're covering them to some extent, and maybe more like retail investors are, reacting to this slow information, so to say. But indeed, it is one of the puzzles, why we don't see an immediate reaction. I agree. It's a good question.
So Pierre Seklos has a question in the chat you might not see. Pierre?
Oh, no, I think the question was dealt with. It had to do with the range of tone and sentiment. Since central bankers, typically we expect them not to want to surprise. I wonder how different that would be from the kind of voice trainers that you use as benchmarks.
So another chat is Robert McCauley. Robert?
Yes, thank you, John. Could you talk us through how you boiled down sort of 5 dimensions of emotion to one scalar?
Yeah, so we have 5 emotions, and we're going to classify neutral as 0. Sad and angry is going to be -1, a negative emotion. Happy and pleasantly surprised is going to be as a positive emotion. So +1 for positive and -1 for negative, 0 for neutral, and then we calculate just the balance of answers. And it's going to give us a statistic between -1 and 1.
If you had disgust, would that be positive or negative?
If you were disgust, I would say negative, but we didn't see a disgusting kind of reaction. So
you can see the hands up. Kevin
yes.
Hassett?
Yeah, hey, this is really awesome and interesting. This is related to Jim Hamilton's point, but just as a backdrop, I left this group to go back to the White House when COVID started, and I was doing White House press conferences. I was on TV all the time, and one of my main jobs was designing the stimulus packages. I guess 3 of them while I was there. And I also was in the middle of designing TICJA. And so when we were doing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I was doing a press conference, then people would say, well, how do you feel about like the action you had today with Congress? And if we had moved closer to passage, I'd be really happy. I would guess it would show up as really high on your scale. But like during COVID, if we're passing a stimulus bill, there were, people dying every day, and during that time, one of my jobs was keeping Jay up to date on what the task force was telling us. And so there's just no way that even if it was like a good news day, that you would have gone on TV and looked happy in that time. And so I kind of feel like probably it could be that there's this lower frequency thing that there was like there are a couple of really bad times in your sample, right? The financial crisis and then COVID. And that during those times, it's somber to be a public figure and have to go on and talk about even, mundane economic policy. And those low frequency things might be driving your results. And so I'd be kind of really interested in seeing some sort of, chow test, sample split type stuff where you look and you show that your results hold, through 2019, during the Trump years or something like that, because I am a little bit worried that the wacky, huge movements of variables during the financial crisis and then during the COVID year could be driving your results. Because I would guess that if Jay went out in press conference, after we had talked about like what we're seeing in the data about, then he would have looked pretty sad and upset, I would guess, throughout the period. And so have you done any sample split type stuff to see if it's being driven by, say, the COVID year?
Yeah, just to be clear, our sample goes from 2011 to 2019.
So it stopped in 20. So it'd just be the financial crisis then?
Yes. Well, we didn't even have, 2011.
They were still doing extended benefits through 2014.
Yes. Yeah. So if we drop, the beginning of the sample, we did that. The results are going to be the same. And one of the benefits of doing bootstrap is basically you draw random samples from the data and you see how much influence they're going to make. And you can just look at the distributions. If there is one observation which is driving everything, that would be definitely a problem for us. We don't see this kind of stuff. And I agree with you. We shouldn't think about happy voices during the COVID as a way to reinsure everybody. It's clearly a secondary kind of tool. But if we can use it, why not?
Michael Boskin, you have another question, Michael?
No. Yeah. The flip side of what I was going to say is there's kind of the intonation in the possible reveal in the Fed chair's voice. And I wonder if there's any ability to maybe with a lot more data or some other way, focus on how the signal's received by different people or different people coming from different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
That could be important. Is that something that's conceptually doable or possible? And maybe even whether the degradation in the signal as it's perceived shrinks over time as the Fed chair learns to modulate or anything like that. Is that, I mean, I understand you have a very narrow set of data for, et cetera, but is that conceptually possible? Is that something that would be useful?
Yes.
Data were rich enough?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we cannot do this with our data, but conceptually it is possible. So the way it's going to work is you have, this audio track from Janet Yellen, you play it to different people and you see how they react to this. And you do this over and over and over many times and see what's their range of perceptions, if there is anything systematic by race, gender, this kind of things. And then in theory, again, you can use this information to tailor your messages, to tailor a modulation of your voice to certain audiences. So, you go and talk to businessmen, they have one reaction. You go and talk to school teachers, you have another set of notes. I'm not sure, people selected to be Fed chairs are trained to do that, but some people may be able to do it.
Politicians. Bill Clinton was trained to do this.
Excellent. Yeah.
So John Cochrane has John, you have a question and relaying other people's questions. Want to go ahead?
No, I was just relaying Pierre's question from much earlier, which is that he says, I wonder whether a form of Goodhart's law might emerge. This is something I think Boskin was talking about too. Will central banks hire voice trainers? And of course, their central bank, there's a big difference between the central bankers and the actors. The central bankers we know are very consciously thinking about what they're not trying to express things emotionally, whereas the actors are trying to do the opposite, to express things as emotionally as possible. Along in the chat was a discussion about that your first Janet Yellen, I had missed your first Janet Yellen video was an attempt to show a positive emotion, which I had read as completely blank.
It was a positive. It was a positive emotion.
Okay, Òscar?
Yeah, I wonder, so in order for financial markets to react to emotions, there must be some information that they think is valuable in trying to forecast asset prices. And so to test that idea, I was wondering whether you could use economic news being released, let's say, the few days following a meeting, and then ask the question whether the surprise that came about on the particular news release correlates positively or negatively with the emotion expressed by the chair.
Yes, Òscar, this is exactly what we are doing now. We are now downloading from Factiva press coverage for different press conferences immediately after, shortly before, see what was the general tone of the media coverage, and see if it makes a difference. It's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Bob Hall?
So I think this came up briefly before, but competition in this space could be provided by a human panel, right? So you just ask people, was Ben one of your 5 emotional states? And now one of the advantages of a human panel is that it's very fast. So you can make a trading profit by looking for one of your long responses that's currently there and create a hedge fund that just asks people for this information content and trade on it immediately, right?
Yes, Bob, if you can give me a seed funding, I will start that hedge fund and trade.
Exactly. Well, I think I'll pass on that.
So Andy had a question in the chat, maybe based on other central bankers.
Yeah, it seems to me that this tool can be used quite counterproductively in terms of the staff of central banks preparing their chairs to express emotions in the right places, just like an actor. Instead, it seems like one should use this tool to basically coach the chair to be as boring as possible, so that you go back to a world where you let the data speak and you let the implicit policy rule of the whole committee, not the chair itself, to guide the market reaction. Which way do you come out on this debate? Should it be used strategically? Is there a strategic use for this to push the market, or is it seen as possibly a way to constrain communication from these central banks?
It's a great question. Should we make it more boring, blunt it, or actually try to make it sharper and use it? I think one lesson I got from Ronald Reagan was that if you can use this tool, you can be extremely effective, and the Fed chairs, the presidents of central banks, they are not trained to do this, but it doesn't mean that they can get basic training and just avoid doing something which is not good. Like we have some examples in the paper when the media is discussing that Ben Bernanke was, saying something in trembling voice, and it sounded, he sounded very uncertain. That was kind of very bad signal to the markets. If he knew that, he's doing that or could be doing that, maybe he would work on that to make sure that he is not sending wrong information to the markets. It seems a useful thing to know at least.
So one question I have is, you mentioned Greenspan was not transparent compared to Powell or whoever. I just found that not correct, because it seemed to me Greenspan was clear about what he wanted to be clear about, and it was actually easier to understand than it is now. I don't know, it could go backwards. That's my own view from watching and knowing the people quite well.
Yeah, John, I think, if I understand your question correctly, Alan Greenspan was clear when he wanted to be, but it was only about a few things specifically. Now people try to be clear about and transparent about everything, and that's probably overshooting in terms of using communications as a policy tool. So there has to be some golden middle when you say more than Greenspan, but you don't have to go in every detail, because most people don't understand the details of those programs anyways, especially when you talk to the general public.
Oh, sorry, I just typed it in. I just had a thought that maybe the press conferences should just be done via text chat. What do you think about that? Like, so since this is, communication that appears to be slightly out of control, assuming your results are true, then would you recommend we call up Jay and say, hey, you need to, you can just do it, via some kind of chat function, or do you think this is something that adds to the toolbox and it should be studied and expanded?
Kevin, I think it should be studied and expanded. One thing you can do, and this is going back to Bob Hall's suggestion, you can have focus groups, and they can play with these tools, see what is more valuable to them. I know, for example, in the Swedish National Bank, the governor often has chat sessions with the general public. Anybody can ask a question and he will type back a response. They're not talking, but he is also doing Q&A after various meetings. So you can compare what is more effective.
Bob, do you have another question, Bob Hall?
Okay, I do. Thanks, son. You can buy a device that conceals your voice over the phone. So that would be another solution.
Yes, you can do this to scramble your emotions, that's for sure. But you don't have to have a device. We did some analysis of ECB Q&A sessions when Mario Draghi was the president, and it was very hard to detect his emotions. Right? So some people are doing what Andy Filardo said, like you just blunt it and you sound like, I don't want to say he sounds like a robot, but he was kind of very even in what he was saying.
And he's a hot-blooded Italian.
Fortunately, it was his DNA, and this is what he was doing.
So, Yuriy, thank you so much. This is terrific. It's so innovative, and all the questions are what if, what about? So it shows it's good work. So thank you so much, and thank your co-authors for joining us. We appreciate it very much. Bye-bye.